Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about exploitation. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, we've got grad student with communication and culture, David Church, on the show.
Hey, good to be back.
Yeah, good to be back. This is your third or fourth time on the show.
Third, I think.
Yeah. We love having you on because you talk about movies that fascinate me. Your thesis is kind of on exploitation films. Mm-hmm. So you're teaching a class this summer on sort of the exploitation genre. And so we're going to talk about exploitation films this week. So I'm very excited because I'm very curious. A quick programming note before we move on. So you guys might have heard us talking about this for the last 6 months or so. Jason is getting married at the end of July.
That's right.
So you don't really have time to record shows.
Yes, you keep asking me about stuff, and I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. I'm going to go see the Katy Perry movie.
Yeah.
To prepare.
So the point is, episodes might be a little spotty for the next month. So we've got content planned, but it might not be full episodes. Yeah. So in our standard format, but we're gonna go see Craig Simpson at the Lily, and we're gonna do an interview with him. We're gonna have really cool stuff on video. I'm going to go – Indie Film Fest is coming up. We're going to have a lot of content around that. I'm going to get interviews with filmmakers. We're going to talk to Lisa, the managing director. So look for that like next week next week. And so we'll have some content, but it probably won't be like full normal episodes. But we'll see. We might sneak one in there. But let's talk about this class, this exploitation film class. Now, I'm an unabashed lover of exploitation film. I think it's fascinating. And I finally figured out why I'm so fascinated by exploitation film. And it basically boils down to what series of decisions must have happened in order for this movie to get made. Who was behind the camera that thought, that's totally a good idea. That's something I want to see on my movie screen. So I've been watching a lot of Roger Corman movies and a lot of, old exploitation films. And it's just like you just watch these films and you're like, who thought this was a good idea? How did this get put on film?
Well, I think there's a lot of ideas out there. It's just who put the money for this to happen, because a lot of people can think of movie ideas, but not a lot of people can finance them. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point of view on that.
Yeah, but that's why I just have to keep watching them. So let's talk about this class, David. This is. The name of the class is Histories of the American Exploitation Film, and this is a summer class. Is this something you normally teach during the summer? Have you ever taught this particular class before?
No, I've never taught this particular class before, so this is my first time out on this. It's a variable topic course, so I know you had Will Scheibel on recently, and he just finished up teaching a different topic on film noir and noir cultures. So mine's a different variable topic, and it's for this second 6-week session, and it's going along well thus far.
Yeah. So what are your kind of goals with this class? I mean, you talk about exploitation film. What are you hoping that students sort of learn about exploitation film?
Well, ultimately, I'm hoping that people will come away from this class with a greater awareness of how much this isn't just sort of an alternate or alternative history of American cinema, but how it's also been really influential in terms of shaping the overall film industry as we know it today. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of ways that it has done that over time, but oftentimes you would find either the mainstream Hollywood film industry reacting against exploitation cinema to distance itself from that and in that sense shaping its own contours. And in other ways you would find, especially from the 1950s onward, Hollywood increasingly taking influence from how profitable a lot of exploitation films were. So things like, for example, the rise of the high-concept Hollywood blockbuster, that's the sort of thing that exploitation filmmakers were really pioneering quite a bit earlier. They were just working with high concepts on very low budgets. And also things like saturation booking of films, saturation advertising, all of those sorts of marketing and distribution strategies were things that exploitation filmmakers had been really pioneering before the mainstream industry picked it up around the 1970s or so. Also, if you look at the way that most films nowadays are made for sort of a teenage audience, or at least a youth audience, and less for the general family audience, or less for only adults. That's something that as well you started to see come up in the 1950s onward, with a lot of exploitation filmmakers going after that youth market in a way that you really hadn't seen up to that point.
Yeah. So now I've always thought of exploitation film as something occurring sort of like 60s and later. You know, I sort of think of that's how I think. But you've got films from as early as like the 30s playing here. How does something like, I'm looking at this list, Reefer Madness and Sex Madness, I guess obviously those are kind of exploitative, but they're not exploitative in a way that's like, look at how great this is. It's like sort of like scare films. So how does that fit into exploitation?
Well, before the 1960s, you had what are often referred to as classical exploitation films, and those were films that were independently produced and distributed, and they were basically dealing with all of these different sorts of issues that you couldn't get away with under the Hollywood production code. So these would be things like drug use and drug abuse, sex hygiene, different ways to educationally justify them to show things like nudity and other things that you just couldn't get away with in Hollywood films. And they did frame themselves as educational as doing some sort of public service in terms of telling people about this social evil that they were trying to warn people against. So there was a very sort of moralistic, but also a sort of reform-oriented aspect behind a number of these films.
Yeah.
And then finally, once you get to the 1950s and onward, the production code falls apart, censorship opens up, the marketplace opens up, and then we start to come to a lot of the sorts of exploitation films, the later, what we might call post-classical ones, which I think people more commonly associate with the term exploitation.
So I remember seeing in fact, I think you got this documentary listed, American Grindhouse, where they were talking about that idea of like trying to sneak in the nudity as like, know your body, or this is how babies are born, or something like that. Like, how would you get that film into a theater? Because I felt like the production code was there to sort of try to keep that away. So how did they get around the production code?
What they would generally do is they would either go through what was called the states' rights market, which was basically an alternate system that would show not only exploitation films, but also things like foreign imports during this time before Hollywood started to import foreign films, and also race films made by African-American independent filmmakers. And basically this was sort of an alternate system for getting films distributed by selling the rights to these things for maybe 4 or 5 years at a time to some sort of regional sub-distributor. And then they could retitle the things and play them on and on and on. And basically this meant that you could get into independently operated theaters, but not the theaters that were owned by the major Hollywood studio chains.
Yeah.
And also what they would do is something called road showing, which Hollywood itself experimented with as well, but not to the same extent. And that's where you would just basically throw the film in the trunk of your car, drive it around from town to town, and try to stir up publicity as you went along. So it was just kind of a traveling carnival-type show that you would build up around these films. And a lot of those films, especially the classical exploitation films from the pre-1960s, they would have a lot more built into this besides just the film itself. You would have sex hygiene lecturers. You would have different displays of like preserved fetuses in jars and fake drug paraphernalia, and nurses standing by to assist people and to sell little sex hygiene pamphlets to people, and all this sort of stuff that went along with all of the ballyhoo.
So was this all just a big front, just as an excuse, or were there actually people there like serious, like, I want to teach people about these things and I'm going to use film to do it?
Well, that's a good question. For the most part, evidence seems to suggest that these people were just in it to get the money, and that the educational or moral excuses were just there to sort of defend themselves. But there actually were some people who did legitimately come to these films because they wanted to get some sort of educational takeaway from it. Like, for instance, many times sex hygiene films would be not only for adults-only audiences, which most of these films were then, but also gender-segregated audiences. So you would have a women's show and then a men's show afterwards. And oftentimes you would have huge crowds of women coming to see these sex hygiene films because topics like birth control, abortion, venereal disease, these were all things that it was just really, really difficult at that time both because of various legal constraints and social mores. It was just difficult to get hold of that information. And so a lot of people were legitimately interested in learning about that. Although the quality of the information that they might have gotten from these films, that's a different story altogether.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm looking at your syllabus here. You were kind enough to send that along to us. And I'm looking at sort of the calendar, and it feels like you've got these kind of broken up into time period. Is that somewhat accurate?
Roughly, yeah. Yeah, so the first week or so which we've just concluded recently, we sort of went through the classical exploitation films of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This week we're spending on the 1950s and really looking at the transition to the 1950s teen pick and onward. And next week we're moving into the 1960s and spending most of our time on that decade, and then the 70s the week after, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So week one, you had Sex Madness and Reefer Madness, which, sort of classic scare films. Mm-hmm. But week two, it sort of seems like you're in the 50s, where you've got a movie I've never heard of called Shake, Rattle, and Rock, and I Was a Teenage Werewolf, which seem sort of like, Saturday matinee type films. Is that about what we're looking at there?
Yeah, I mean, they are pretty clean and pretty wholesome compared to a lot of the other films on the syllabus. And it's interesting because rock and roll was such a controversial topic at that time, especially linked to things like juvenile delinquency and so on, and especially because rock music was associated with African-American musical culture. And there was often a sort of racial component in terms of how these so-called primitive, rhythms were coming in and potentially corrupting the white middle-class suburban youth. So there was a sort of sensationalized aspect to these films that doesn't really translate that well today. Mm-hmm. But if you sort of go back and excavate some of that historical context and sort of see how people were talking about the sort of moral panics that grew up around an increased awareness in a teenage market, which was something that was pretty new at that time, something new that people were tapping into, and also juvenile delinquents and rock and roll and all this stuff sort of coming together around this time period.
Yeah. So how does this fit in? I mean, how does this fit into like your overall idea of like the exploitation film? Because these don't really feel like exploitation. I mean, you've got Scorpio Rising here, which definitely sort of fits in with that as well. But how does that kind of fit in with the sort of the overall idea of where you're taking them on this idea?
Well, thinking of exploitation more broadly than just simply things that might have been totally disreputable at a given time period, but also things that may have been controversial or timely, and looking at things like how films like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and Shake, Rattle, and Rock were both made by American International Pictures, which is really sort of the quintessential post-classical exploitation film company. They really sort of had their finger on the pulse of teenage audiences and were directly trying to target teen audiences for a number of decades. And so by looking at sort of how, in many ways from the 1950s onward, you started to see independently operated exploitation film producers and distributors really, in a lot of ways, imitating major studio successes and trying to capitalize on them by making short-term production trends and little cycles that would spin off from these larger successes. That's something that I'm trying to sort of open people up to and seeing how there are different lines of influence back and forth, kind of reciprocal lines of influence between what the major Hollywood studios were doing, but then also what these smaller independent companies were doing.
Yeah. So it looks like week 3. There's now one of the films listed here is Night of the Living Dead, which I think most people would just think of now as like classic horror, but obviously at that time it was thought of as like an exploitation sort of film. There probably weren't a lot of movies, mainstream movies at least, in that sort of frame. And there's also a film I've never heard of, but it sounds like sexploitation, Rent a Girl.
Yeah, Rent a Girl it's an interesting New York-based. It's kind of a roughie, which was sort of a subcategory of this exploitation film that arose in the mid 1960s. And it's interesting because sexploitation films often deal with these issues of what happens when you have the 60s sexual revolution and you have all these other people whose desires are starting to be acknowledged, or it's starting to sort of come on the public scene, even if the mainstream hasn't necessarily accepted them yet. And you often see, for example, a lot of the rhetoric of the sexual revolution was framed in terms of free love and everyone make love, not war, all of that kind of thing. But at the same time, it was you still had lingering gendered elements in terms of it often being a sexual revolution waged on men's terms. And so what happens when women are still held up to certain double standards that men are not when it comes to the sexual revolution? And that's something that you often see come up in a number of sexploitation films. So in Rent-A-Girl, for instance, there's a young woman who wants to be sort of hip. She wants her fiance wants her to be pretty cool and open and liberal and everything, but she ends up getting a job as a nude model, and this leads her to fall in with very kind of sordid, debauched characters, and she kind of goes down the rabbit hole further and further into these weird sort of orgiastic parties and stuff that she starts getting invited to. And basically what you start to see is that she herself thinks that she's doing something where she's following and enacting her own desire. She thinks that she's doing something where she actually is very liberal about her desire and very open about what she wants. And it's interesting as a sexploitation film because a lot of it takes place within her head, and we sort of hear her trying to justify to herself, how she can go do this, nude modeling and all of these other sorts of activities. And meanwhile, her boyfriend or fiance is very much sort of shocked at this and taken aback at what she's done, even though, of course, he's sort of encouraged her to do these very same sorts of things without necessarily knowing it. So it's a really fascinating little film in terms of a sort of artifact from this time period, how you see those different contradictions playing out in terms of the sexual revolution.
Yeah. How does home video kind of change exploitation film and sort of make it different? Because at a certain point, and it changed the pornography industry as well, because you don't have to go to a theater anymore to watch a movie, any movie. So the ones that you would least want to like go out in public and sort of let people know you're watching sort of become home video. Is that what happened with exploitation as well?
To a great extent, yeah. Around the same time that you found a lot of hardcore pornography coming into the industry and coming into theaters like drive-ins and urban grindhouses in the late 70s and on into the 80s, you started to find more and more exploitation filmmakers just sort of bypassing those theaters altogether because it was more cost-effective just to release their material straight to video. And I think that's still very much the case today. And we might sort of ask, what is the state of exploitation cinema today? You can look at things like the direct-to-video market for genre films, and why might we consider them exploitation? Why might we not? It seems like oftentimes we have this idea that exploitation cinema, much like film noir, for instance, is something sort of rooted in the past. It's something maybe pre-video or at least on the cusp of home video. It's something sort of pushed back there into the 60s and 70s, but we often don't tend to think about exploitation cinema as something that's still very much with us even today. But I think if we look at even some of the really culturally devalued direct-to-video genre films that come out, we could see those as still a continuation of similar things. And likewise, some of like the made-for-TV movies like Sharktopus and stuff like that, which of course Roger Corman was responsible for producing. So these are all continuations of these longer traditions, but we maybe don't have quite as much historical distance between ourselves now and these older films to really appreciate them in the same sort of partly ironic but partly sincere way.
Yeah.
But, it's just like when people – and I think that's something that people think about when they hear exploitation. They kind of think just sort of so bad it's good. But there are some legit really good movies out there that actually have sort of a core to the story, and they're trying to show you something. But would you say that's pretty true, is that when people kind of hear that term, they just immediately think like Sharktopus or, like made for TV? I mean, I think that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, a lot of people do tend to assume that exploitation means just bottom of the barrel Ed Wood movies or things like that. But I think we can appreciate those movies in more ways than sort of the ironic, so bad it's good mystery science theater sort of reading for every possible thing we could mock in these films. And some of them are legitimately responding to real historical concerns and anxieties, and still I think have important things to tell us today.
Yeah, well, I think one in particular that's listed here that you've got, I'm so happy that you have this listed, because we saw this at the cinema last semester, and I thought it was one of the best movies I've ever seen at the cinema, Ms. 45, which I thought was amazing. And I really liked the fact that it kind of toyed with the audience a little bit. It kind of acted like it was going to be a sexploitation film, and then it really kind of smacked you in the face for thinking it was a sexploitation film. So that one is definitely one that I would say, yes, it's an exploitation film, but it's also a really good, powerful, effective movie.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly good sort of character study of how this woman responds to the trauma of having been sexually assaulted multiple times in the course of a day, and it's an interesting film because she herself is mute, and so there's sort of a message going on there in terms of how she's sort of finding her voice through the kind of violent revenge that she takes against people fairly indiscriminately, against men particularly. And so you start to get to this point where you ask yourself, is her revenge justified? Has she gone off the deep end? What is up with this woman? And it opens up some really interesting questions, I think, in terms of how much we are expected to sympathize with her and how far we're willing to sort of go with that.
Another film that is listed here, again, one of my favorite movies ever, Friday the 13th. I just love that movie. So, and this one's a little bit later on. You also have Superfly in here, which, is a classic blaxploitation. Yeah. So, I mean, do you feel like Friday the 13th is sort of a turning point or sort of a, some kind of modification of a genre? Or do you just feel like it's just sort of a classic example of what this kind of slasher movie was at that time?
Well, the way I'm looking at it in this class, I'm looking at it in terms of some work that's been done recently about how people have often seen the slasher film as a very sort of misogynistic type of horror film with, of course, women have sex, and therefore they get murdered, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all about sort of punishing women for their desire. But what you actually see when you go back and look at the decisions that were made for making something like Friday the 13th is that the producers were actually very deliberately trying to soften the violence. They were trying to bring in certain aspects from earlier films like Carrie, for instance, one of the few films from a few years earlier that had a very strong female protagonist within a horror framework. And also even drawing in some of the teenage hijinks from movies like Animal House from a few years earlier, and I think Meatballs around the same time. And so all that stuff sort of comes together here, and even some of the stuff like the roller disco movies and a lot of just weird stuff coming out of the late 70s. They were sort of trying to mash all of this together into a movie like Friday the 13th, and a lot of that gets lost on us today because we now, partly because I think Friday the 13th was so influential in terms of coming on the heels of Halloween and then spawning all of these sequels, that's sort of become so cliched that we lose track of all these other threads that it was deliberately trying to draw upon to exploit other financially successful films that had come a few years earlier at the end of the 70s.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I think that'll do it for this week. So, David, thank you so much for coming on. You always sound way smarter than most of our guests, so we really appreciate that. So thanks so much.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So we'll get out of here. Yeah. So I'm Andy.
I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.